Welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 290 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, our last show of 2021. Hello, Maya.
Hello, Pilar. Hello, everybody. What a year it's been.
Another year of lots of stuff. Another year. So, listeners, today is another What's Going On episode, more of a What Went On episode. And we're going to look at what do the different versions of remote look like now? What does remote work look like in all its 10,000 different variations? You can find any links of stuff that we talked to, although we don't have many links today. You can find those in virtualnotdistant.com. If you go to the podcast tab, you can find the show notes, which are basically blog posts. So if you look at our blog and you've read all of the articles there and you want more to read, then you can check out all the show notes from the podcast, which Maya puts together so beautifully so that readers as well as listeners can enjoy our show. Right, so let's go straight into it. Why not? Why not? Yes, so Maya, I've really seen over the last year, because also we've had this explosion of conversation around hybrid, and that of course means lots of stuff. But we've also seen people adopt remote work in their teams and in their organizations differently. So I thought we could just maybe share some examples of what we've heard, what we've seen, just to give listeners a variety of, a picture of what's going on.
Absolutely. Though, as you pointed out in the pre-recording conversation, there was diversity already in the pre-pandemic space. People had approached remote work setups differently depending on where they were coming from. I just think it's got kind of more diverse and, dare I say, messier in some cases, depending on people's starting position and their speed of transition and everything else. They brought a lot more of their traditional office expectations into the remote space, trying to replicate them lock and stock, and that's led to a lot more differentiation, I think, in what we've ended up with.
And it'll be interesting to see once there is that time, which is not right now, to really settle into it, what that looks like. And I think you're right. The word messy, without putting any judgment on it, is what it is. It's because of exactly what you said. Yeah. So let's have a look at what that messiness might feel like. I think, as you said, there's always been diversity, and an example that always comes to mind for me is taking two examples of figurehead distributed companies pre-pandemic, so Automatic and Meet Edgar. Hearing Matt Mullenberg once say in his podcast or in an interview that at Automatic there was such a diversity in how people worked. They have more than 1,300 people. That some teams were very asynchronous, so a lot of non-real time, a lot of use of tech to leave messages for each other and communicate through mainly documents, versus some teams that were very synchronous, who maybe had lots of meetings. And even in that company, he was seeing that diversity. And then I think of, for example, Meet Edgar, who, when you look at their document of how they work, which is open, you can see that they've got set hours that they almost do a default to video or default to meeting, whereas in Automatic they would default to async. So already we had that spread.
Yes, and I don't know if it reflects a deeper kind of cultural thing of whether a team is more that they need to work in a more interdependent way that suggests a more synchronous way of doing things as the default, or whether in some cases that's a legacy of the fact that you were all in the same building anyway and this is how we've always done it. And the skill is probably in being able to unpick the two. What things will work asynchronously? What sort of balance should we be looking for? And I love the way Automatic embrace the whole spectrum and accept that there are teams and individuals and particular kinds of activity that do require, they're not down on meetings and saying you shouldn't be working in that very close way. And we know that there must be a lot of software developers there who have to work in pairs and teams and things to do what they do. And yet they have this very clear underpinning of it all with lots of written asynchronous communication so that those who aren't in that space mentally or physically or temporarily can keep up with what's going on. So it's just all requires such a lot of deliberate planning, though, doesn't it, to make it work like that?
Yeah, and interesting that Automatic grew organically and eventually they evolved into this thing. And it as you were speaking, I was thinking that Automatic, of course, had that office in San Francisco that they got rid of eventually. So it's making me think, if we look at now, and I'm not even thinking of any specific examples, if we look at the term hybrid, which means that
I thought we weren't going to talk about hybrid anymore.
Yeah, well, hybrid is a subset of remote.
Yes, okay.
I am going to go with that. Hybrid is a subset of remote, and really, really encouraging organizations and people who are making these decisions to take that view, and especially at a team level. Maybe at an organization it gets really complicated, but at a team level we have to see hybrid as a subset of remote, because the office is another collaboration tool. However, at the moment, there is that difficulty of, the space needs to be managed because of COVID at the moment. So we can't just have anyone can come into the office at any time. We can't have that because there's regulations. So there is that, which makes things very difficult. And so it's I can see the difficulty in then delegating to the teams to make these decisions as well, because it's this, I would say, lack of control, but also lack of what's going on. And also they've got accountability. So you need to know what's going on in your building. And now that we mentioned that Automatic, for example, let go of their office, I wonder sometimes if there's a fear of what happens if our offices don't get used. Do we do what Automatic does and take that step and go, right, we're officeless? Do we downsize the real estate? Do we become we give people co-working spaces? I'm just thinking that even the thought experiment of that is like, no, actually not. Let's just make the office to be used.
It's challenging, isn't it? And I think in a lot of commercial organizations, as they get bigger, you do end up, because of the way that traditional business structures work, with a kind of almost competitive interdepartmental thing for who has the corner office and who has the best building, but also for budget. And there's a sense that if you give something up, you'll never get it back. If you come in under budget 1 year, then that will be clawed back. And if you've managed without an office for 2 years, the suggestion that you might not need to going forward could mean you never get that resource back again in your budget. So you can understand there's a reluctance to let things go. And yet, once you do, it's that we were talking about this in another context quite recently. There is a sense of having to clear out space of the old to let exciting new things into your life. And maybe it's the organizations like Automatic that were courageous enough to do that. And then, of course, they've got that budget back then to use on technology or amazing retreats or cultural activities and all the other things which go to strengthen that team wherever they are.
Another organization that's coming to mind is Basecamp. Because they had, I don't know if it was this year or last year. I think it was last year. They had this whole thing of, I think their lease was coming up or something was happening with their office. And they didn't just let go. I seem to remember, I don't know if you remember what they did. I seem to remember that they hung on to it for a bit. And I think they kept it in the end. I can't remember. So even an organization that is very remote championable, a remote first organization, even they had trouble letting go of their real estate. So it's a very interesting conversation.
Yes. Or there are others like Dropbox that have completely repurposed it and said, okay, well, we've got these buildings, but they're not offices anymore. They're collaboration hubs, and we will redesign them in order to accommodate the kinds of activities we expect you to be doing here. And you do your officey stuff at home or wherever, but you don't need to be with other people for that. So, it doesn't mean you have to, because obviously the other thing with commercial real estate is it tends to be one of the longest time things that we're committed to in business, with like 5-10 year leases. So it's not as easy to say, right, this month we're not having an office. You're probably stuck with paying for it for a long time.
Yeah, good. So yes, the how you use the building, that also needs changing. So this is some of what we're seeing that is being shared widely, and also by companies who are very used to being open. I also wanted to just share some of what I'm seeing in maybe the more traditional organizations, what is happening at a more granular team level, and something I've noticed is the use of technology is very interesting. So even when we're looking at a remote team that wants to embrace asynchronous practices, we have all these tools that we always talk about, like Trello. We love Trello. And of course, all these tools can be used in different ways, and the rhythm of how we use it might be different. And I've recently been working with some people in my team that for Adventures in Podcasting, that they use Trello almost like near instant and near real time messaging. So when I tag someone, I might get a reply really soon. And I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I suppose it just goes to show that all of these things can be used in different ways with different kind of protocols. Maybe some people think if they get a tag on Trello, there's an expectation that it's a synchronous conversation. Oh God, better make another comment. And all of these things do have the functionality within them generally to be used for either purpose.
Yeah. Yes.
Whatever the design is meant in the first place.
So that is one way of working in a remote team that we might see is actually this, again, like what you're saying, is this replication of or what we think that working together means. We will think of working together as in working together in very near real time. And so what we might see in some teams is this explosion of using online tools and using the online space, but using it in very real time, versus the other side of the spectrum, which might be, I've also heard some teams saying, well, we're not meeting. We're rarely meeting anymore because we don't need to, because we have all these other expectations of how we're working, and we're able to get on with our independent tasks. So we don't meet.
Yes, and sometimes, sadly, there's been no thought beyond that to how do we replace the connection and the relationship building that those synchronous encounters facilitated. And it's perfectly possible to replace that in some other way, but it doesn't happen as organically when you're not in the same space. It can't do.
I think also sometimes it's difficult to ask for something. So what I'm thinking, we rely a lot on async and we're very independent, and then it becomes really difficult to say, can we meet? Especially if we don't have something specific to talk about and be like, well, do we need to? We have all this. It's like, yeah, but I'm really missing. I mean, this is the whole problem of something we are starting to tackle through virtual non-distant, is the whole problem of loneliness.
Yes.
And that feeling of disconnection. I say starting to tackle, we have a whole podcast series that was all about that, a whole series of episodes. And this can be one of those things, is that we embrace the asynchronous space so much, but like you say, not having thought about how we can use it for connection, not just for alignment. And suddenly it becomes really difficult. And to stick your hand up and say, I really miss you guys.
Or even just, could we have a call about this?
Yes.
But it's the same in personal life, isn't it? As well, there are, people you can be very close to, but you just default to WhatsApping all day. And then I remember messaging my daughters earlier this week saying, can you come downstairs? We want to talk about something. And I just thought it was just something nice that I thought it would be easier to do face to face. But they came downstairs looking terrified. Like, what is this huge high stakes thing that we can't just WhatsApp each other?
Yeah, that's the thing.
I needed their permission to kind of invite them to a synchronous family conversation. It was very weird. I mean, that's Generation Z.
Well, but the parallel is someone who shared with me, this was pre-pandemic. They were in charge of a remote team, and she said, well, it was a remote team, but there was only one person not working from base. So she said, I've just realized I only call up this person when I have a problem or an issue. And so they know at the other end, they're there, the phone rings and they go, oh my God.
It's my manager.
Yeah. So like you say, and especially if you are in a position actually of management, normalizing this balance of synchronous versus asynchronous is really important. And I feel really guilty because I'm always advocating for asynchronous, but actually we must not forget the balance, and that not everyone is like us async geeks. We're happy. Like you say, we still feel connected even if we haven't talked to someone.
We do. And it's nice to have an actual call, even though sometimes we have to switch the mics on and record a podcast just so we talk to each other.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that noticeable, and we'll mention Becky at the end as well. But Becky, are one of our other two team members who are relatively constant with Virtual Not Distant. I don't record podcasts with her. So, and then I noticed, I think it was at the beginning of the month, I was like, I don't think I've actually talked to her since September in real time. We do a lot of to and fro and tagging in. I mean, we speak asynchronously every Monday and Wednesday when she's working with a company. But otherwise, and then I thought, I haven't met with Maya for ages. I thought, no, I do. I speak with Maya for an hour.
At least we speak for an hour. I'm just trying to think if I've ever actually spoken to Becky. Which seems astonishing, as she's been working with us for months and months. But I'm trying to imagine what her voice is like, and I can't.
Yeah. So this can happen, and this is the thing. I think these are the pitfalls of both poles, and it's refinding that balance, and actually having these conversations in the team, maybe not in the podcast. Well, it's great. It's then there's Ross, who we only communicate via Trello. Yeah. And the other day there was a Trello message that hadn't been answered by either you or Ross. Becky had, and I sent an email. And it was just, it wasn't a high stakes or important email. It was just, I think you've missed that. Here's the link. And he replied and said, oh yeah, I must have missed it. It's also okay if you ever need to, if it's something is urgent, you can call me. Yes, I know, Ross, but this wasn't urgent. But it's really it's fascinating, and time goes really quickly as well. And suddenly you can spend like 6 months and you realize, actually, I haven't had a really good conversation with this person.
And I can be like that with my parents, though. I mean, I think there's a lot that's different when the relationship is already there.
Yeah.
When it's already built, then you can use the asynchronous stuff, can help cement and reinforce that in very light touches. Whereas if it's somebody new, and particularly with reference to recruitment and onboarding, there probably needs to be more deliberate attention to synchronous, live, rich media communication, at least in the outset, till you feel you've got to know them a bit.
Yeah. Yes, and just going back to the versions of remote, having that awareness of what our team is doing. And actually, I think we probably need to start, we always say this, developing a new language, because actually saying that our team is remote doesn't mean anything now.
No, it's just, we have a team.
Yeah,
it's just work. I think the whole remote work description will, and it's the same, we'll all be remote, we'll all be hybrid. Yeah. That just defines the fact that we work together. What we really need to do is talk about how.
So I think the what you were saying before about really understanding. So this is what's influencing what kind of remote teams we have now. Is one is the dynamics between team members at a personal level, because it could well be that, your tasks are not interdependent. However, you like your company a lot and you like to know that the other person is at the other end, and that is something that's working and you want to maintain that. It could also be the speed at which you need to communicate because of what you do. That will also influence the type of remote team you are. And also sometimes also the level of trust, because I think sometimes we don't realize the high amount of trust that is needed just to know that stuff is happening without being told about it at all levels within the team and at a management level as well, and trusting that. And I think that's also a conversation worth having, that whatever we're setting up, how much do we need to tell each other? How much do we need to ping each other? And how much can we just, I don't know, work out loud.
Yeah. And to what extent do people sort of feel differently about official communication or sort of notifications from the organization as opposed to casual conversations between themselves? Where do people really feel they get information about what's going on in the team, in the workload, and so on? I remember seeing some research, it might even have been last year, about the balance shifting in Slack and related conversations between private messaging and open channels, and what that can indicate about the kind of psychological safety within an organization if people are taking more stuff to closed bits of communication. That, there is clearly, that might be one signal of a trust issue, which you perhaps wouldn't identify so much if you were co-located, though maybe you'd see people talking in little huddles and things around the office, at least digitally, then maybe you can track it a bit better. But there are so many ways that trust shows or doesn't show in communications, especially when those communications are eternally digitized.
Yeah. So that was part of episode 267. And it was, I don't know if this is the same one you're thinking of, but Mark Kilby had written a newsletter post or a blog post about this with some data and everything.
Right.
And he came and he shared it with us in episode 267, which is about mindset changes of the remote manager, 1st of April, 2021. So that's something that happened.
Okay, that was this year then. It just, this year's been like a decade.
Yeah. I think, maybe what we can do is afterwards, we can maybe go through going through some of the stuff that we've talked about on the podcast. That might be quite interesting, just at a very light level. Yeah. So there's all that. Is there? Let me, because I've changed Trello cards. Is there anything else? So there's the other. It's the other thing with this concept around asynchronous communication and how it's being seen. And it's that, for me, asynchronous communication and saying that you adopt asynchronous practices in the team doesn't just mean that you do your work away from each other, but also your communication. So for me, this whole piece around asynchronous is about communication. It's not just about the fact that we have flexibility when we do our tasks, but that we've also adapted flexibility in how we get in touch with each other. And I think that might also be something that teams differentiate themselves in, that, we are fine that we're all doing our little bits of work away from each other, but actually we don't expect, for example, many messages in online spaces because we actually got the meetings for that.
That we expect we sync up to report progress or to have a daily stand-up or whatever, even though we're working independently. Yeah, I think that's it's a little bit like going back to that pre-pandemic metaphor of the 5 levels of remote work from that was from Automatic, wasn't it?
Yes.
I think a lot of people are still quite low on the pyramid, in the sense that they haven't evolved the ways of really making async work, that they can carry out a lot of separate activities, but they need to check in with each other because they don't have the mechanisms to really communicate about the work asynchronously in a way that they all trust and that they know that everybody's going to work in the same way and consistently, that people are going to communicate well enough in written form that it's not going to require clarification, and they won't. You can post something as an update and know that will convey all the information, that there won't be anything to discuss about it, and so on. It is quite a sophisticated level of async, and there are people who are getting the activity level right, but still have a way to go on the communication level.
And I think that's worth reflecting on and making clear also if we are recruiting and even if we're settling how we're working, because I think realistically, unless there's a big need to go that far, I think that many teams will stay at that. They will stay in the asynchronous task doing stuff of that flexibility, but also we stick to that. But I think that is worth seeing because, again, the same way as we're saying how remote is going to mean very little, it could be that saying that we work asynchronously also starts to mean very little. So
again, we just need better vocabulary, don't we? How async in what ways do you mean about your communication or your activities or your separate deep work or whatever? Because the vocabulary we have simply isn't up to that differentiation at the moment.
Yeah. And it could be, I think, for people who are thinking of moving jobs. The first episode in the new year will be about someone who moved jobs. Marcus Wermuth will tell us about what it was like to move a job from one distributed company to another distributed company. I think for people looking to shift jobs, it's worth asking about some of this detail and this level of detail of how the team works, because it's becoming increasingly important not just to know what your job is going to entail and your job description, but how you're going to fit or how you're going to have to adapt within the team. And the same for recruiting, of course, and even shifting within, I'm thinking, for example, in local government or across government or even within a large corporation, even if you're on secondment or if you're moving around the organization, this is actually also a conversation worth having.
Definitely. And it starts even before that in trying to decode the job advertisements that, why this is a task for content creation, but why is it saying I have to be available in instant messaging for these particular hours? Does that mean I'm expected to be in synchronous chit chat for the whole of that time or not? And you can start to glean these little clues, which are seeping their way into the job ad space. And obviously that can lead to more explicit questions that you might want to ask as part of the recruitment process.
I think in a way this is so exciting because before, remote work suited mainly this kind of person that needed this amount of contact and stuff. And now actually it's broadening so that even if you're if you're a person who likes to be quite in touch with people throughout the day, you might be able to find that, but also choose the location.
Absolutely.
Where you work.
It's not like remote work 5 years ago where it would have meant swapping some emails and, maybe the occasional video conference. Now, if you want to be in continuous synchronous communication remotely, there are plenty of roles and organizations where that's expected. And if that would make your head explode, there are others where you can get on with your introverted deep work in peace. And this is all part of the differentiation that we're seeing. And it's a good thing. We just need to kind of explain it better.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm seeing is the of course, I mean, this follows on, is the huge diversity in how tools are being used, in particular collaboration tools like Teams, because we're going from everything happens there and people are masters of notifications to, well, it's there, here, find your way, nothing happens, no community management, no role modeling, nothing, usually because of time. This is another thing, is that unfortunately, I can't say anymore, you need to sit down and work out, because it's really difficult. I just cannot see that happening over the next forever.
No. People aren't going to suddenly, after winging it for 18 months, step back and craft a detailed communications protocol, are they?
Because unfortunately, so what I felt at the beginning of the pandemic was that a lot of teams and organizations and individuals who are already at full capacity, we're talking knowledge workers, I don't know what it's like in other sectors, they were really at full capacity of how they were working. And what the pandemic did is it pushed that, and it might have come back a little bit, but people are still at high capacity and there is no time or headspace to take that step back. And my concern is that never happens, because the next, I don't know, even 5 years, I would go as far as to say, it's just this constant change. And of course, even once the pandemic thing gets sorted, we're going to have to look at mergers, about big changes, restructures, who knows? I think that there's going to be quite a period of change, and it doesn't look like it. So it's almost like I think that teams need to find the space in their everyday activities to be having some of these conversations and tweaking their communication systems.
Definitely.
And very small as they go along.
If they don't do that, we can already see what the consequence is, that people do it unilaterally and say, right, I'm leaving this team or this organization. And that's going to be the tragedy of it if people leave. Especially the new year, we know is going to bring another wave in the Great Resignation. And people are going to take knowledge and ideas and progress and everything with them, because these structures don't exist in the remote space, often for structured handovers and sharing of all of that. So if you can give people space within the team before they reach that point to talk about how they want to communicate, how they want to share, how they want to plan, how they want to use these tools, then it will stop people reaching that conclusion for themselves and hopefully finding a new start somewhere else. But I think a lot of organizations don't know yet how much is in people's heads in terms of how they've survived the last couple of years. People have figured things out. They've found the right tool. They've worked out ways of doing things remotely, but they haven't documented it. They haven't formalized it. They've got nothing to pass on to somebody new coming in that role. And I think this is going to be one of the unforeseen consequences of the Great Resignation in a lot of organizations if they don't look out for it.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So something to leave you with.
Yes,
thinking
not
and
to be
pondering.
too depressing.
No, well, it's also an opportunity. It's really an opportunity. If we have, the thing is that until we know why we want to do something, it's not going to happen. And actually saying, look, some of these things you've got to start implementing, because if not, this is what's going to happen. Then I think that's a great motivation to start. And once you start to think about changing that, then you start to see other things that you can tweak along the way. So it's a good place to start, even if it comes from a place of almost fear. It's a great starting point as well. The last thing I wanted to touch on, Maya, is, and I think this is something we need to be thinking about, is not to assume, and I keep hearing this still, that the younger generations are going to struggle less. Because I think this is still that conversation of, the younger generations, what you were saying, they are used to more tools. They're used to lots of texting. They're used to lots of communicating online in different ways. They're not afraid of technology at all. I imagine they're not afraid of changing tech. They probably pick up stuff really quickly. However, it's the same conversation as we could have had 50 years ago. Just because I know how to have a conversation with my friend doesn't mean I know how to have a conversation with a client.
Yep. And it doesn't mean I'm going to learn that by osmosis either when we're not together. Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
But I keep hearing, with the younger generations, it'll be easier. No, it won't. Because something else I heard the other day, I don't know if it was in a podcast or a conversation, that, and even you, similar to what your own example, Maya, young people, the younger generations are not used to the phone, for example. And the phone is a great communication tool that is being so underused even by people my age. People, if you're in the same country especially, just pick up the phone. It is really quick. It doesn't have video in it. It's less intrusive than setting up a meeting.
Yeah.
And it's better, faster and richer than 10,000 messages coming up
Even
and
if
down.
you've got to send one message first to say, is this a good time to
Yeah.
we never just phone people.
The phone is beautiful, but what I did hear in I think it was in a podcast, someone saying, well, they just don't do it. People don't. They go into video more. It's like don't use the phone. So you see that it's not as simple, and it takes me back to I think it was maybe episode. Oh, look, I've got it here. Do I remember? Episode 6, people, 28th of November, 2014.
Wow.
I talked to my friend Sinead McManus, who had set up a company then to train virtual assistants. And she said the same thing. She said, we cannot assume that the younger generations know how to implement what they do in their day-to-day in the workspace. So we cannot assume that. There's a lot more than the fact that they are not afraid of the tech.
Yes.
So I just want to drop that there as
Absolutely. We have to replicate all the stuff about mentoring, role modeling, professional development. All of that has to be duplicated in the online space for people coming in new to the workforce. And if they've come in the last couple of years, they might not have had the normal office experience at all. So that is really important. And sorry, just a shout out there, 2014. Pilar, you are truly one of podcasting's OGs. That is amazing. And 7 years in remote work, that must be like, I don't know if remote years are like dog years. It's just sort of multiple generations of evolution in this space that has been going on with the 21st Century Work Life podcast. So respect.
Yeah, it's great. And you, and of course, you individually as an individual are pre that.
Yes.
I remember, because it's the last episode of the year, we're going to do a bit of reflecting. But I think, Maya, you were maybe the third interview I did ever about podcast. And in fact, I think maybe it wasn't a podcast episode. It was just some audio that maybe I hung up at some point on this website. I don't even know. And we had this conversation and we said, what we think and what we would like to happen, and this is, we're having the conversation like 10 years later, I think.
Isn't this astonishing?
Wouldn't it be great if we don't talk about virtual teams anymore and we just talk about teams? So we were like, yeah.
Yeah, but it's so slow for people to change their behavior, and actually what's going to make this go mainstream? Gosh, we never could have imagined what's happened in the last couple of years and the transformation that it's wrought. I mean, we couldn't imagine this 2 years ago, really, when we were hearing about this virus in Asia, that, what would happen in the space of work in the Western world.
It's crazy.
I think we need to sometimes just remember that, how much things have changed, how far we've come.
Yeah. So, listeners, we'll wrap up this big, meaty, well, we've just opened this conversation now. We'd love to hear from you. We're not finished yet, but just in case this is as long as you want to listen to a show, which is about 34 minutes, so that's a nice length, virtualnotdistant.com for your messages. We'd love to hear your opinions around this, your own experience. We have a contact form there. What we'll do now is if we can we'll go a little bit more introspective into the team. We've got loads of shout outs to people who have been sharing our stuff or contributing in some way to our content, and a couple of internal things that we'd like to share. So let's go up for some virtual not distant news. So, Maya, the first thing I'd like to share with listeners is that we have a new workshop that we've piloted already. Mm-hmm. And this, it might not come as any surprise, it was tackling loneliness in remote teams. So I think, I can never remember the title of the workshops. I think it's Overcoming Loneliness in Remote Teams. And we're developing this with Dr. Richard McKinnon, with whom I podcast on My Pocket Psych, which hit 100 episodes a few weeks ago.
Yay!
That's another 5 years of podcasting. And we piloted this with one of our regular clients. And I think it's, an important, very important topic because there hasn't been time to tackle it properly, I think.
Yeah, it's really important. And it's one of those things that I think people can say, yes, we do a lot of extraordinary things in an emergency situation, but there's a price to be paid later on if you don't pay attention to the well-being aspects. And maybe now is the time. People really need to reflect on what their team needs and the kinds of things they need to put in place to keep people emotionally safe. Mm-hmm. And this is, if you don't know where to start, you're not sure whether what you've asked of people is reasonable, you're not sure how people are individually, then this is a really good way to kickstart that process.
Yeah, and it's really complicated. I mean, this is something, of course, that I've learned a lot also from Richard, is how loneliness, how it creeps in differently with people. You already mentioned the stigma around talking about it. Sometimes we don't even have the language. Sometimes we might not be able to recognize what it is. I mean, we know there's something wrong, but we might think we're depressed, or we might think we're sad, and it's really difficult. So I really like this workshop because we're trying to give the conversation some depth rather than just, we could do this. And then through understanding what it is we're talking about and the differences that exist and how actually it can go from no connection to too much connection, and the loneliness creeps in. It's fascinating. And then, of course, we can start look at the different levels in which you can adopt this depending on what you think your team needs.
And I think, for a lot of teams, this might be just not something that you talk about. It's not part of your day-to-day conversation and vocabulary. So this is a really good moment to think about getting an external bit of input to kickstart the process. And I think, with the greatest respect to Pilar and Richard, doing a workshop isn't going to fix this problem for you and your team. But what it can do is open up the conversation, give you the tools and vocabulary to begin making things better. And the benefits for the organization and the team, as well as every individual, will be incalculable. So I really recommend that you check this out.
Yeah, thank you for the plug. And also, I think you raise a very, very important point that us as a company delivering training as well, and something, of course, I've seen even most this year because people were just grasping for information and advice, is we keep also the workshop short, 2.5 hours max, because online is such an intense experience. But at the same time, I think that's all you can do. Because going back to the old model of a full day, I always thought full days, they're great because they give you space, and they give you space to reflect. You get away from your usual surroundings for a day. Maybe if you have more chats and you have space for those chats. But actually, sometimes we just need the penny to drop in one aspect, and that's all we're going to have time to act on. Because let's face it, when we leave these content-packed sessions, there's only one or two things we're going to be able to really act upon.
And that was all we used to get out of the 3-day conference, wasn't it? You know, if you got a couple of nuggets or something you could apply, then you consider that a good exchange of time and value. So it's better to do a 2.5-hour workshop and get that.
Exactly. And something like loneliness, what we're doing is shifting a little bit the conversation, maybe than the mindset, and just give one or two things that they can do straight away. Good. So let's have a look at all the different people who've shared some of the content. Oh, we got quite a lot. And they go back to. I'll just have them. We've got them in the list. Shall I just go down the list?
Go for it.
Yes. So we've got LinkedIn. So we have a page on LinkedIn, Virtual Not Distant page, and that has stuff. So you can follow it. It highlights some of the articles that we mentioned in the newsletter, some of the stuff we talk about here. It's a nice page. I can say that because Becky's been managing it. So Loda Conaway on LinkedIn, she shared a Management Cafe episode, because remember, listeners, that we do have a show called Management Cafe, which is all but pod faded, but there's some stuff there, and actually some of the episodes have been quite useful. And she was sharing it, and she shared the Management Cafe episode on thanking for a job well done, and she shared it towards psychological safety in virtual teams. So excellent. Thanking for a job well done. This must be the one about celebrations. I can't even remember, Maya, what the Management Cafe episodes are. I'd like to give a shout out to Pedro Valero, because he has been liking and sharing lots this year on LinkedIn and Twitter, on both platforms. So thank you, Pedro. Joe Clark for sharing the post, How to Increase Psychological Safety in a Virtual Team, by Gustavo Razzetti on LinkedIn. So this is an article that we shared. Hector Olea Leon for sharing and tagging others, also on LinkedIn. Bart Van Roy for sharing us article on Twitter. And Teresa, she commented on the post on improving psychological safety. She said, I was fortunate to interview an international team that had improved psychological safety during the pandemic. One change factor was how they used the chat, asynchronous communication, and here is how they did it. So she's actually linked to her article. We'll put these links in the show notes, if that's okay, Maya.
Absolutely.
Jennifer Riggin, she commented on a post of an event that that I was part of, as part of, I think it was AgiNext, her conference. Annie van Woudenberg, she's had also lots of engagement with our stuff and some great comments. Oh, I'm going to leave Gemma's DM for last, because I loved it. Annette on Twitter, she did lots of likes and shares. And thank you, Tammy, for the note on the post on asynchronous. So this was a blog post that's been released on our blog at Virtual Not Distant, which incorporates some comments on how to enable asynchronous communication in Teams, which includes Tammy Bjelland, if I said that right, and Katerina Bolle-Carbonell, Morgan Legg, and you, Maya. I think you were the ones who commented. And she said, not only do I love this content, but also I love the practice of summarizing an asynchronous conversation in a useful way.
Making async even more async.
Yes.
That's a good spot, Tammy.
And that's, that is something that in an ideal world where we had the time, but maybe we've got more time than we think sometimes, is, and I think I've seen a team or an organization doing this in practice. The chats can sometimes get very full, like the Microsoft Teams, the Slack, even sometimes Trello. And if you pick a common theme or something that's emerging, you can put the spotlight on it and say, hey, there is something here we can pull out. And going back to your point about documenting a lot more than we probably do, Maya, and bring that out and turn that into a valuable piece of documentation for the team rather than just part of a conversation that's been going on.
Definitely. And I think that's one place we maybe see some breakthroughs coming up technologically in the next year ahead, just ways to kind of surface the really relevant points and summarize the stuff that's bubbling up in conversations, because we could all drown in messages and there's no way to kind of index them and find the information you need quickly. So I think there should be some better solutions coming along to help us do that.
Yeah, so thanks, Tammy, for that. For that comment. And then finally, I got a direct message from Gemma on Twitter, which it just made my day because she just nailed what I was hoping the show would do. She said, just a quick message to say I love your podcast. I'm a massive fan of your conversations and considered opinions over remote working. And this is the bit I loved. I always feel like I listen to your podcast like it's a conversation in a cafe that I'm overhearing and want to know more about. Really welcoming.
Oh, that's so lovely. Oh, thank you, Gemma.
Thank you, Gemma. I hope you've enjoyed your 45-minute coffee with us. Because they do get long. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much. And listeners, you know where to find us, virtualnotdistant.com. We're on Twitter at Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O, and on LinkedIn, Virtual Not Distant. Got 2 more shout outs which deserve their own little section. One is Rowena Hennigan, who has been on the show a couple of times, has started a newsletter on well-being for the remote worker. And this is through LinkedIn. So I haven't had a chance to check it out yet, Maya, but have you?
Yes, I have, and highly recommend it. It really connects so well with your workshop on loneliness and everything else that we're doing to try and make remote and distributed teams stronger and healthier in the new year. So definitely sign up to what Ro's doing.
Yeah, so it's she's on LinkedIn, and again, Maya will very kindly stick the link in the show notes. And finally, a big shout out to Becky, who has been working with us behind the scenes
asynchronously,
very asynchronously. And Becky came to us through Boldly, which is a company that hires out premium virtual assistants. And what Becky's been doing, she's been looking after the LinkedIn page. She'd actually taken over some of the admin around the podcast show notes. She's been helping to put the newsletter together. We have a shop page now on the website, but we haven't promoted it yet. Talk about not having time or headspace to do stuff. She's been doing a lots of stuff behind the scenes. But unfortunately, she's moving on. She's moving on from Boldly, so she's also got to leave Virtual Not Distant. So I just wanted to just thank her publicly for being there, just supporting, keeping the heartbeat of the company going.
Yeah. Thank you, Becky. It's been a pleasure working with you. Yeah. We know you'll be successful in wherever life takes you next, and you'll leave a gap behind at Virtual Not Distant.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And thank you, listeners, for especially if you joined us this year. I hope that you are enjoying us. If you've been listening to us since 2014, well, I'd love to give you a hug, but...
Yeah, no, don't do that.
Don't do that yet. Oh, God. Because I know there are listeners that have been, and you know who you are, who have been here with us for a really long while, and it's really amazing. So, Maya, I'll rattle off the calls to action, and then I will pass over to you. But again, virtualnotdistant.com, we have a newsletter you can sign up to with recommended reading and listening. And also when you sign up, you can download the PDF on leading through asynchronous communication, or leading through visible teamwork, which is all about async. We have a page on LinkedIn. We have the Twitter handle Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O, which actually Becky was also looking after. And if you want to contact us, virtualnotdistant.com, there's a contact page. And if you want to email us, then use my email directly, Pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. Maya, any words of wisdom for our listeners to close 2021?
Oh, only to say that wherever, however, whatever you're celebrating, I hope you have a good one and get to spend time with the people you love this Christmas, and looking forward to a new year, whatever challenges it may bring. We'll be here for you, trying to navigate these strange waters of virtual teams. But here's to a healthy, happy, prosperous and peaceful one for all of us.
And the same from me, listeners. Have a lovely end to the year. And if you're listening to us at a time like in June 2023, for example, well, I hope you have a good day. Thank you for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.